maybe 300 people will join. We'll see. Okay, are we ready to start?
Yes.
Perfect. Good morning, everyone. I am Tithi Bhattacharya, and I have the unique privilege of welcoming you to our lecture series on social reproduction theory, or the SRT lab. I want to begin with some good news. We have just gotten news from our friends that the ceasefire has been signed in Gaza, so subhanallah, and we want to acknowledge also that there is a genocide currently ongoing in Palestine, and I hope that this ceasefire is the starting point for a permanent peace and a free Palestine. I will do a little bit of an introduction for this project before I hand it off to this session's chair as well as the speaker. Although the term social reproduction theory has been in circulation more recently, research on the topic has been ongoing for nearly 5 decades by feminist theorists and scholar activists. This online lab is the first step in our plan to establish a transnational research network, which we hope will help cohere what is clearly a growing field of social reproduction studies, ranging from sociological explorations of racialized welfare, migration, labor policies in the US and Europe and the global South, the analysis and politics of debt and social movements, to historical studies of state violence in many places in the global South, including Brazil and India, to name only a few. Much of this rich body of empirical research is informed by and informs the theoretical approach of SRT that critically builds upon Lisa Vogel's 1983 book, Marxism and the Oppression of Women, and develops a historical materialist account of capitalist societies by analyzing the necessary but contradictory relation of all life-making labors to capitalist value production. These theoretical explorations are now a recognized point of reference among scholars and social movement activists, inviting new questions and pointing to the need for further empirical and theoretical work. Yet the two strands, one of empirical research, the other of theory building, are yet to come together to establish an academic field of study with clear methodological premises and research norms for scholarly instruction. The lab and the planned research network, we hope, will initiate this process of casting SRT as an interdisciplinary field of study. While the work of establishing this network is ongoing at multiple levels, the most important component of this work is engaging in dialogue with other scholars and activists. In this series, thus, we will be in conversation with leading SRT scholars, all of whom I'm very proud to say are also scholar activists. We will also feature ongoing SRT initiatives by our co-thinkers, so I encourage you to send us details of any project on the topic that you might be engaged in. The email for all correspondence is socialreproductiontheorylab@gmail.com. I will also put it in the chat. For now, I'd like to draw your attention to the Pluto series on SRT, co-edited by Professor Susan Ferguson and myself. We have several exciting new additions to the series, including a book on Erotics and Alienation by Alan Sears, a book on childbirth by Anna Fielder. This year, we will also be adding a co-edited book by Susan Ferguson and myself on Palestine and SRT. So watch the Pluto page. There are two networks that I would also like to point towards that are doing vital work in SRT. The first is in Brazil, led by Raiza Rua and her comrades. And the second one is emerging under the leadership of Sarah Ferris in London. Both Raiza and Sarah are future speakers on this series, so don't miss their sessions. Finally, before I hand this over to today's chair, I would like to note that the work of this lab would have been impossible without the support from the following people. Dr. Frederick Davis, the chair of the history department at Purdue, who supported this project enthusiastically. Vipanchika Shahasri Bhagyanagar, who is so much more than a research assistant, being a formidable emerging scholar herself. And Susan Ferguson and Erin Jaffe, my co-conspirators for this and many other adventures in anti-capitalism. I could not and would not want to change the world without them. And of course, I thank our amazing speakers who were as generous with their time as they were with their kindness. And on that note, I turn this over to Professor Susan Ferguson to introduce our first speaker for the series. Thank you.
Thanks, Tithi. And it's amazing to see all these folks from all over the world. It's wonderful and heartening. So thank you all for tuning in. And we've got an hour and a half, I believe. So I don't want to take too much time in any preliminary discussion, but because I know Kirstin's got a really interesting and provocative talk for us, so I'm looking forward to hearing that. I will introduce Kirstin. She'll speak for about 20 minutes or so, and then I'll have a couple questions, but then we'll open it up so that it won't be too much of back and forth between Kirstin and me. Okay, so Kirstin Munro, who is an assistant professor of economics at the New School for Social Research, and her first book is called The Production of Everyday Life in Eco-Conscious Households, Compromise, Conflict, and Complicity. And that was published in March 2023 by Bristol University Press. Her second book, which will be published by Verso in 2026, shows that Marxist feminist theories of household production must go beyond notions of women and wives in order to fully grasp the contradictions between human needs and the imperatives of accumulation. And most recently, she's been in touch with Tithi and me because she's also editing a collection of essays by Lisa Vogel for the Pluto Press. And these are essays that have not seen as much light of day as they deserve. And that's for the Mapping Social Reproduction book series. And the expected release date for that is later this year. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to you, Kirstin. Thanks so very much for joining us.
Thanks so much. It's really nice to be here. I really appreciate the invitation to participate today. And I guess I wanted to begin quickly by giving some credit where credit's due, because the key figures in social reproduction theory, I think, these people who are here with us today have done really admirable work to reinvigorate Marxist feminist theorizing. And these efforts have brought much needed attention to neglected and forgotten participants in Marxist theoretical debates of the past. I think gratitude is also owed to the very, very small handful of scholars who continued to publish and advance rigorous Marxist feminist theorizing through periods when Marxism had fallen out of favor in gender and women's studies, or maybe even more out of favor than it is today. And I think it's, again, just very valuable for us to remember that this list of people is very, very short. And I think, we all owe a lot to them. If I understand the initiative correctly, the objective of the Social Reproduction Theory Lab is to discern methodological premises and research norms needed to establish social reproduction theory as a legitimate interdisciplinary academic field of study. To do this, social reproduction theory needs to be able to answer the question, what is social reproduction theory actually a theory of? The answer isn't entirely clear to me, And many of the attempts to answer this question, at least the ones that I've encountered, have been pretty unsatisfying, maybe galvanizing for the purposes of popular political education and organizing, but in my view, far too vague and non-specific to form the basis of a robust interdisciplinary academic subfield. To be clear, I do not consider myself to be a social reproduction theorist, but I think we have many shared aims. Most fundamentally, we wish for a world free of exploitation and oppression. We want to build the sorts of theories that can help clarify paths that might get us there, and we find in Marx a framework to build those theories on. Over the past few years, I've published several critiques of social reproduction theory that I hope have been taken by social reproduction theorists in the comradely and constructive spirit in which they were written. Some other helpful critical engagements include those by Amy Diath, Patty Quick, Marina Vishman and Zoe Sutherland, Beverly Best, and Rebecca Carson, and I'd encourage everyone here to seek them out. My plan for today is to outline two of my critiques of social reproduction theory. First, I want to discuss the meaning of the term social reproduction and how the meaning of that term has evolved over time. Second, I want to discuss the problems that are introduced when social reproduction theorists, like Marxist feminists more broadly, uncritically adopt the positive understanding of labor from the Marxism of the workers' movement. I want to end this portion of today's event with a list of 10 items that I believe, if addressed, would help advance social reproduction theory as an interdisciplinary field of study, and that can, maybe it's a lot of items, but maybe some of them can serve as the basis for our discussion during our remaining time. It's kind of a throw spaghetti at the wall and see what sticks kind of list. Someone who's better trained in the sociology of science than I am might be able to help us understand the game of telephone that occurs as ideas are transmitted through syllabuses, reading groups, popularizations, citations, and selective readings. Why do we read and cite some things and not others? How do secondary interpretations influence how we read original sources? How can we update theories developed by previous generations of scholars to suit the sensibilities and problems of today? Our intellectual work can be like collages made up of cut up pieces of photocopies, of photocopies, of photocopies, seeming to distort and degrade with each duplication, but when the work is done well, also creating a wholly new and hopefully relevant image. Maybe the most obvious way this has occurred in Marxist feminism is related to the term social reproduction. So we're clear on definitions. When I say social reproduction theory, I mean the relatively recent Marxist feminist offshoot that borrows from Dalla Costa and James the idea that women who perform tasks on an unwaged basis related to the reproduction of the commodity labor power are members of the working class and thus capable of participating in class struggle. And from Lisa Vogel, the notion that labor power is reproduced not only in the family household on an unwaged basis by mothers and wives, but also on a waged basis by unproductive workers like teachers and nurses. Social reproduction theory does this to correctly identify who is a member of the working class in order to argue for the working class position and revolutionary capacity of people outside the so-called productive economy. Based on this objective, social reproduction theorists explicitly redefine social reproduction from its conventional definition to instead refer to the reproduction of labor power alone, or sometimes the vague concept life-making. To add more confusion to the mix, sometimes people now use the term social reproduction theory as a new retroactive label for all of Marxist feminism going back 50 plus years, for example, by referring to Lisa Vogel or Selma James as social reproduction theorists. I've made the case in a number of places over the past few years that the term social reproduction in conventional Marxist usage refers to the reproduction of a society as a whole. It isn't a particularly original contribution. I'm going to point out in a minute that pedantic Marxists have been kind of harping on this point since at least the late 1970s, but I'm going to take credit for being the first person to raise this issue with respect to social reproduction theory, even if it means taking credit for a fairly banal idea. But the key point is that within capitalism, the society that's being reproduced is capitalist society. So it follows that if you are a communist, then the reproduction of capitalist society is a bad thing. At a joint speaking engagement with Lisa Vogel a few years ago, I mentioned that, in contrast to social reproduction theorists, she exclusively uses the term social reproduction to mean the reproduction of capitalist society as a whole throughout her body of work. She quipped back immediately, "So does Karl Marx." In some of my earlier writing, I pointed to Joanna Brenner and Barbara Laslitt's work starting in the late 1980s as the original source of this redefinition. But I had that timeline wrong. At some point in the late 1970s, some feminist scholars, and in most instances, these are scholars deliberately and explicitly distancing themselves from Marxism, began using the phrase social reproduction to mean something other than the reproduction of society as a whole. In some cases, it's used to mean exclusively the reproduction of the commodity labor power, but in other cases, it's used to mean human sexual reproduction, like the birthing of children, or the caring for children, domestic labor in general, unwaged work in general, the intergenerational transmission of culture, or life making, or just about everything positive that women do or the state provides to the working class. By 1984, Jane Humphreys and Jill Rubery acknowledged that this redefinition of social reproduction to mean, quote, the daily and intergenerational renewal of human resources has been controversial, while also claiming that this redefinition is now established precedent by 1984. And you can see this usage in non-Marxist feminist sociology and anthropology continue through the 1990s. Where you will not see this redefinition is in Marxism and the Oppression of Women, cited as a key source of inspiration for social reproduction theorists. Going back in time, 3 early critiques of this redefinition can be found in Mark Cousins and Edholm Harrison Young, both in 1978, and Michelle Barrett in 1980. Each of these authors point out that part of the uncritical adoption of the term reproduction happens because words have multiple meanings. Edholm Harrison Young write that, quote, this appears to be a straightforward case of nominalism, conflation based on the, I can't say this word, okay, you know what I'm saying, homonym term reproduction. Similarly, Mark Cousins asserts that this conflation is merely based on a pun. Laslitt and Brenner, cited as the source of this redefinition in the Pluto Press Social Reproduction Theory Edited Collection, explicitly tell the reader their feminist redefinition should be distinguished from the Marxist one when they redefine social reproduction as, and I think it's worthwhile to read their definition in its entirety to hear what they're framing as an anti-Marxist, non-Marxist definition of social reproduction. Quote, the activities and attitudes, behaviors and emotions, responsibilities and relationships directly involved in the maintenance of life on a daily basis and intergenerationally. Among other things, social reproduction includes how food, clothing, and shelter are made available for immediate consumption, the ways in which the care and socialization of children are provided, the care of the infirm and elderly, and the social organization of sexuality. Social reproduction can thus be seen to include various kinds of work, mental, manual, and emotional, aimed at providing the historically and socially as well as biologically defined care necessary to maintain existing life and to reproduce the next generation, unquote. This transhistorical definition of social reproduction, a description of a process devoid of any social form or purpose, is deliberately offered as a non-Marxist concept. It could apply to any society. Some authors have now replaced the phrase social reproduction with life making to mean more or less the same thing, and as a result, this concept suffers from the same problems. From a Marxist political economic perspective, this definition is so vague and all-encompassing that it's been completely evacuated of all potential theoretical power. This definition frames these maintenance activities as part of a transhistorical general labor process, the production of use values via purposeful activity involving objects of labor and instruments of labor, something, quote, common to all forms of society in which humans live. One outcome of this transhistorical general labor process could be the renewal of labor power in general, defined as the capacity to labor, or quote, the aggregate of those mental and physical capabilities that allow someone to produce use values. However, Patrick Murray and Jean Schuler remind us in their recent book that no actual labor process ever exists independently of any specific social formation. There is no labor process in general. I think I can add to that, there's no domestic labor process in general, no household production process in general, no social reproduction in general, and no life making in general. While many social forms, Tony Smith specifically mentions commodities, money, and profits, but I think this could include household production, existed before capitalism. He points out that, quote, one of Marx's fundamental insights is that these were not the same social forms as commodities, money, and profits in capitalism, although we use the same words. This is because the social forms analyzed by Marx in Capital are historically specific. So what do we lose when we lose the definition of social reproduction as the reproduction of a particular form of society rather than one element of that society? I think we lose the insight that accumulation and the reproduction of capital cannot be divorced from the reproduction of labor power, and the reproduction of labor power cannot be divorced from the reproduction of capitalist society, nor from the social misery inherent to it. And when we neglect to describe these maintenance activities in terms of their historical specificity, we make the same mistake that Marx criticized Adam Smith and David Ricardo for. While I can appreciate the political expediency of painting life-making activities and the people who perform them in a virtuous light, we need to remember that the life that is made is that of a worker who must compete with other workers for the opportunity to sell her labor power, spending the majority of her life maximizing surplus value. In short, I think the framing of social reproduction to mean not only something positive, but to reflect a transhistorical and explicitly non-Marxist concept represents a huge step backwards. The second issue I want to address is the uncritical adoption by social reproduction theory of the positive category of labor from the Marxism of the workers' movement, expanded to include reproductive labor. Again, I can appreciate the impulse to adopt a positive understanding of reproductive labor in order to gain recognition for these overlooked activities or to claim moral or economic validity for the people, disproportionately women of all races and racialized men, who carry them out. However, this approach is flawed because doing so is inconsistent with an interpretation of the critique of political economy as a critique of these perverted economic categories themselves. Such a critique requires situating a theory of the reproduction of labor power in terms of a larger critique of labor, value, and production in capitalism. Nona Glaser points out that when we conceptualize all socially useful tasks as work or labor, then we render these concepts no longer useful for political economic theorizing. There's a troubling productivist tendency on the part of some feminist scholars to define all socially useful activities as work, with the implicit assumption that work is somehow honorable and superior to non-work. If the reproduction of capitalist society is incumbent on the perpetuation of reproductive labor, the commodity labor power, and capitalist production, then these activities that are glorified by others as forms of work or labor, whether waged or unwaged, are integral to this negative process. Labor in capitalism, whether waged or unwaged, productive or unproductive, should not be viewed as the virtuous and morally enriching source of all wealth, but rather as a key input into the reproduction of capitalist society, which is, I need to emphasize again, not a good thing. So I want to change gears, and given the format of today's event, I want to end by offering 10 hopefully pretty brief bullet points that I hope can serve both as the basis for our discussion and that can hopefully aid your efforts to establish social reproduction theory as a rigorous interdisciplinary field of study. Number one, I would urge everyone to stop retroactively claiming contradictory portions of Marxist feminist theorizing from the past under the new banner social reproduction theory. I don't think I'm being pedantic. My reason is I think this co-option is creating a very confused intellectual history and a distorted movement history. I feel slightly different about the concept social reproduction feminism as part of a taxonomy of feminisms. Number two, I think social reproduction theory needs to grapple with the biological essentialism present in basically all Marxist feminist theories. It draws on if, it's a big if, social reproduction theory is going to be a theory about gender. However, number three, I think you should ask yourselves whether or not you want social reproduction theory to be a theory about gender in the first place. Without biological essentialism, can you even get to a unitary theory? I don't think so. I haven't found a way. Since 1973, Lisa Vogel has been insisting that we should be looking at the family rather than women and wives as a starting point for our analysis, making room for the wide variety in working class household configurations around the world, and I would add genders. Number four, I've heard some people claim that social reproduction theory's innovation is that it corrects the omission of racial difference in earlier Marxist feminism without explaining how specifically social reproduction theory does this. I think some reflection is needed on the dangers of reproducing liberal narratives about the lack of concern with race in the feminisms of the 1970s and 1980s. This is simply not true of Marxist feminism. And I think, the essays in this forthcoming edited collection of Lisa Vogel's essays have the receipts for how it's not true. This kind of liberal narrative is false. Number five, if the redefinition is going to be retained, I think you need to be much clearer about what social reproduction entails. Is this all socially useful activities, specifically only waged and unwaged labor involved in the reproduction of the commodity labor power? I think this matters for building a theory of the ways these activities are related to accumulation, which is important if, another big if, social reproduction theory wants to be a political economic theory. Number six, if the redefinition is going to be retained, I think some exploration of the non-Marxist or anti-Marxist origins of the redefinition is warranted. What is lost for Marxists by adopting a trans-historical notion of life-making activities stripped of social form or purpose? Number seven, I think social reproduction theory needs to grapple with the productivism and ableism that comes from uncritically adopting the positive understanding of labor from the Marxism of the workers' movement. Several people are already involved in this important work. I think some of them are in this Zoom, but much more is needed on that point. Number eight, and I think this ties into the purpose of the lab in general, there's need for empirical investigations rather than merely assertions about the extent to which reproductive labor represents a subsidy or a benefit to the capitalist class. Does capitalism actually depend on reproductive labor? I don't know. It's not clear. This is a question that can only be answered with specific empirical analysis, and any answer would not apply to all times and places. This is another point that Lisa Vogel has been raising since 1973. You can't just assert this, right? You need a separate empirical investigation of the extent to which this is true. Also, a number of people have pointed out that household production doesn't necessarily represent a subsidy, or that cost minimization from the perspective of the capitalist class can't necessarily explain existing or idealized family household configurations, and it can't necessarily explain the social assignment of reproductive labor in capitalism to women. One or all three of these points, I think these are forgotten points, but they've been made by a lot of people. Like one or three or all three have been offered by Cynthia Coburn, Michelle Barrett, Lisa Vogel, Rosemary Hennessy, Michael Heinrich, Patrick Murray, and Jean Schiller, and myself. Repeatedly making empirical assertions without empirical evidence threatens social reproduction theory's potential as an interdisciplinary academic field of study. Number nine, I'm almost done. Number nine, related to that last point, I think social reproduction theory, if it's going to be established as an interdisciplinary field of study, needs to distance itself from concepts and framings that are merely politically galvanizing. I don't think good theory and concepts should be oriented around making us feel good about ourselves. In a sick society, I think good theory often feels really bad. Number 10, and again, apologies for being a bit provocative with the final point, and maybe it's a bit repetitive. It's kind of more of a set of questions. And again, I want to emphasize that, like everything else I've said today, this is with utmost camaraderie and intellectual respect and with our shared goals in mind. I think you need to grapple with what's lost and what's gained by explicitly distancing social reproduction theory from Marxism, both in terms of the name and by adopting an explicitly non-Marxist definition of what social reproduction entails. I've like really upset some liberal feminists. I'm talking like full on blocked on Twitter upset by pointing out the key figures in social reproduction theory are, as the kids say, literal communists. They get really mad. They get really upset when they hear that because they think it has nothing to do with Marxism. Maybe there are some people in this Zoom who are like melting down right now. I don't know. Hopefully not. And I've seen a lot of evidence of liberal co-option of social reproduction theory in conference programs and scholarly journals. And so are there things that you're doing that are making this outcome more likely? I don't know. Is this a problem for social reproduction theory, or is liberal assimilation and co-option actually the intended outcome? And I guess maybe in other words, is it possible that this co-option is necessary for establishing social reproduction theory as an interdisciplinary field of study? All right, that's all I have. Thank you so much. I hope we can have an interesting discussion now.
That's great. Thank you very much, Kirstin. That was a very wide-ranging critique, but you do a great job of laying out, I think, a lot of the questions. I would say some misunderstandings of certainly the some specific formulations of social reproduction theory. But no, I really appreciate what you've pulled together here, and I can't possibly, and I won't possibly ask you to respond on all these points, but I'm sure there's enough fodder there for folks in the group as a whole to think through if they've got specific questions they want you to follow up on. I'm just going to